You trimmed your quilt, which means you got rid of the extra batting and backing from around the edges of your quilt. What's the next step? It's time to attach our binding. Hi, I'm Julie Patterson of JCT Quilting, and I want to help you turn your memories into quilted treasures. Your quilt is trimmed and now it's ready to be bound. In this video, I will show you how I use my sewing machine to attach the binding first to the back of the quilt and then to the front of the quilt. I like to store my binding on a binding baby, as you can see here, but you can also just keep it off to the side, wrap it around a ruler, wrap it around cardboard, whatever works to keep that binding intact. I'm going to start by attaching the binding to the back of the quilt, but I'm not going to start at the beginning of the binding. I'm going to leave 4 to 6 inches and then start stitching. When I start stitching, I'm not going to backstitch or lock that stitch in place because it's possible I will need to rip out some of those seams later when I make my way all the way around the quilt, and I will be stitching over it when I finish the binding, so it's okay to not lock that stitch in place at this time. I will continue stitching with a 1/4 inch seam all the way around the quilt. When I approach a corner, I slow down my stitching and then I will stop the needle at about a 1/4 inch from the edge. At that point, I will lift the needle. I do not cut the thread. I will lift my presser foot and I'll turn the whole quilt and the binding. So you can see here that I'm pushing the binding up to form a right angle and then bringing it back down to form that nice corner. The binding will still align with the edge of the quilt, but now it's aligned with the next edge instead of the previous edge. Now I will continue sewing along this edge of the quilt using a 1/4 inch seam. I'm at the next corner, so I'm going to slow down the video again so you can once again see how I stop the needle, lift the presser foot, take the binding fabric up to form that angle, and then bring it back down along the side of the quilt. And then I keep sewing. I rounded the last corner and now I'm close to my original starting points. So I'm going to cut the thread, lift my needle, lift my foot, and to match up the bindings, I start by cutting a little bit off my initial piece. This is usually just a selvage edge. All I'm looking for here is the piece of fabric to tell me the width that I need to use. I take that little piece of fabric and line it up with my initial part of the binding. Then I lay the second part on top of it and I cut just short of that full amount. So if it's 2.5 inches, I'm going to cut just short of the 2.5 inches. I like to use a binding clip to hold that fabric together. And then I'm going to sew the 2 binding pieces together. I take the top strip, the piece that I sewed last or most recently, lay it right side up, and then I take my initial binding piece and lay it right side down, and I match them up corner to corner, and I'm going to sew diagonally down the middle, corner to corner. But I use lots of pins because it can sometimes be hard to keep these pieces in place. So we're going to sew corner to corner, careful not to sew over those pins. Then before I cut the fabric, I'm going to make sure it actually fits. So you want to unpin it, unclip it, lay it out, stretch it out. It looks like it's a good fit. So now I feel comfortable cutting the fabric, and I'm just going to use my scissors and rough guess that 1/4 inch. And then you can either finger press or use an iron to press that seam. We want to make sure it's as flat as possible. Press it back flat and then go back to where you were, back stitch, lock that stitch in place now that we're sewing and we know we have things where we want it, and finish this 1/4 inch stitch around the rest of the binding. You will want to finish by overlapping your initial stitches. Remember, we didn't lock those in place just in case we needed to seam rip them to get this binding where we needed it. So now you're going to want to lock it in place. Stitch over those stitches and then do the back stitch or lock that stitch in place. Now the binding is attached to the back of the quilt. Good job! Now I'm going to show you the process from a different angle in case it was hard to see earlier. After my binding is attached to the back, I have found that it is helpful for me to iron the binding open, pressing it out, and then it's easier to bring it to the front on the next step. Now we're ready to stitch the binding to the front of the quilt. You can start anywhere you want, it doesn't matter where. I like to start by putting a binding clip in place and then starting my stitching just past that binding clip. That binding clip will just help hold the fabric down as I'm starting my stitch. I've pulled the fabric over and then I like to sew another 1/4 inch. I would encourage you to practice binding on some smaller samples so that you can get a feel for what seam allowance you like best. I like to do another 1/4 inch. It shows the stitching on the back still on the binding, which is what I prefer, so I match my thread to my binding, and that's where the stitch is both on the front and on the back. Some people prefer a bigger seam allowance here, and then the stitch on the back would be on the back of the quilt or on the backing fabric and not on the binding. There is no wrong or right answer. Just do whatever is comfortable for you. It makes the most sense and maybe is the easiest or comes most naturally. As I approach a corner, I'm going to stop, leave my needle in, put a binding clip on the side and on the next side, and then tuck the fabric in the corner. I'm just cutting a loose thread, not the attached thread. Tuck the fabric in the corner in the way that it doesn't add extra bulk. So you will find if you tuck the fabric one way, it will create more bulk because it's interfering with the fabric tuck from the other side. And if you tuck it the other way, it will not create as much bulk. That's the way that you want. So I use the binding clips to help guide, leave the needle in to pivot at the corner, and then keep stitching your 1/4 inch seam allowance or whatever seam allowance you are using. I'll slow it down one more time so you can see another corner. I know the corners are the trickiest part, so I want to make sure you're able to see it and understand the process that is taking place. Now as we're coming to the edge of the quilt, you don't need to do anything special when you're attaching it to the front. You just keep stitching. Just pull that binding over to the front and stitch. I recommend stitching over your initial stitch, lock that stitch in place with a back stitch, and you're all done with your binding. Good job. And now I'll show you parts of the process from a different angle. your quilt is all done. Good job turning memories into a quilted treasure.